Hello, Peacewavers from Sydney. I'm Alison Broinowski, and I'm a member of World Beyond War. I'm also a member of Australians for War Powers Reform. You're going to hear a bit more about that in the next hour. What else you're going to hear about, particularly, is AUKUS. You may not know what AUKUS is. It's an acronym for Australia, US, UK. And some people say it ought to be pronounced "you sucker," because it's a deal under which Australia pays a large amount of money for a large amount of military hardware to the United States and the United Kingdom for very little tangible benefit. And that is one of the issues that a lot of our speakers in this next hour will be concentrating on.
Starts with me.
Henry Kissinger said, "To be an enemy of the United States is dangerous. To be a friend of the United States is fatal."
A nuclear war involving only a fraction of the nuclear weapons that exist in the world today would be so great that there'd be blocking of sunlight, reduction of rainfall, agricultural impacts on the world's main food crops, rice, corn, soy, wheat, with the result being global famine, affecting possibly up to 2 billion people.
I'll let you tell the story, David. How has this film managed to land at a time when we seem to be having so many of the conversations nationally that you're focusing on?
Well, I think it's just serendipitous that I've been making this film for the last 8 months or so, interviewing some top military and political strategists on the east coast of Australia that really informed me and informed the film that I've organically put together, which is very take-home message is that if we're not careful, we're going to be dragged into a war with China, our biggest trading partner, which will very quickly turn nuclear.
As a Trident II re-enters the atmosphere at speeds of up to Mach 24, it splits into up to 8 independent re-entry vehicles, each with a 100 or 475 kiloton nuclear warhead.
Whilst I don't carry a torch, and none of these people I interviewed carry a torch for China and what it's done with its own minorities and what it's done with Hong Kong, none of us believe that China is bent upon invading Australia or setting up bases in the South Pacific.
A full salvo from an Ohio-class submarine, which can be launched in less than 1 minute, could unleash up to 192 nuclear warheads to wipe 24 cities off the map.
They were going to make a commitment, most likely, to committing hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer money into these nuclear-propelled submarines, which takes us into another league altogether. We are, in effect, becoming a nuclear middle power. Now, while the government is at pains to stress that the nuclear subs are not going to be having nuclear missiles on board, they still will be nuclear reactor-driven, and that is enriched bomb-making materials.
A full salvo from an Ohio-class submarine, which can be launched in less than 1 minute, could unleash up to 192 nuclear warheads to wipe 24 cities off the map. What possible excuse is there for such monstrous, nation-destroying weaponry?
That's a good question to ask again of you, Prime Minister Albanese. What possible excuse could there be for such monstrous nation-destroying weaponry to be used?
Do we really need subs that can go all the way to China now, or is in fact our best interest in defending Australia from any potential aggressors just in the waters around Australia? As Hugh White says, we could have Sons of Collins-class submarines in the water within 2 or 3 years, which are built in Australia, giving a lot of jobs to Australian workers rather than 15 years' time when the UK-based subs may be delivered to Australia and so on. That will be defending Australia. We do not need to be interoperable with the United States because that puts us at the mercy of US foreign policy. And as we've just seen and said, that is likely to drag us into a war with China, which there are going to be no winners.
I hope an Indigenous voiced parliament will result in Aboriginal people determining the fate of military installations and objectives on their sacred land and seas, because no one possesses the cultural and spiritual connection they have to country, and it must be preserved. Hello, everyone. My name is Kellie, Tranter, lawyer and human rights activist, and I will be facilitating the discussion this evening in relation to the implications of the government reports on AUKUS, nuclear submarines, war powers reform, and the Defence Strategic Review. It is a great pleasure to introduce Brian Toohey. Brian was a columnist with the Australian Financial Review and has also written for the Nikkei Asia Review, the Western Australian, the Sunday Age, and other publications. He was editor of the National Times and a Canberra and Washington correspondent for AFR. He is the author or co-author of 5 books: Secret, The Making of Australia's Security State; Oyster, The Story of the Australian Security Intelligence Service; Tumbling Dice, The Story of Modern Economic Policy; The Book of Leaks; and The Winchester Scandal. Among other subjects, he has written extensively about national security policy since 1973. The American public intellectual Noam Chomsky, and you may not know this, Brian, describes him as, quote, Australia's leading military correspondent, highly knowledgeable, close quote. That's a very impressive accolade. Brian will speak on the implications of the report on AUKUS and the nuclear submarines. Brian, over to you.
Nearly everything this government says about nukes is ludicrous and highly deleterious. I'll give some brief examples. Despite the Defence Minister, Richard Marles, saying that Australia will not participate in a war over Taiwan, Hugh White, a former Deputy Secretary of Defence, says the US would never sell nuclear submarines to Australia in these circumstances. They sell these nukes because they need them. They're in their line of battle. So without guarantees that we will always use them in a US war, they won't sell them. We need to get clear out of this that Australian sovereignty does not exist. Miles now says the subs are not for war, but to protect Australian merchant shipping. 26,000 cargo ship movements to and from Australia occur each year. Nuclear submarines have terrible maintenance problems, and if we buy the expected 3 from America before 2040, only 1 is likely to be operationally available at any one time, and probably none. 1 or none can't protect 26,000 cargo ship movements, but the mainstream journalists swallow all of this nonsense.
The brief that I've been given is to talk about my thoughts on the implications of the Defence Strategic Review. Now, I can only speculate about this, of course, because the review hasn't been released yet. It's not expected until early next month, as Kellie mentioned. However, I don't think it's too difficult to discern what the basic framework of the review is going to be, because it's not really intended to be a genuine independent review that will offer fearless and frank advice to the government based on sound evidence. Rather, the review was commissioned, in my opinion, to provide a rationalisation for a defence policy that has more or less already been decided. The independent leads charged with undertaking the review are established insiders, not known for challenging government orthodoxies, and they won't give much time to undertake a comprehensive review anyway. None of the submissions were made public. There were consultations, but with a narrow band of mainly foreign defence contractors, internal security agencies, and think tanks closely aligned with government thinking, like the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and the US Studies Centre. In other words, the review was set up to ensure an outcome that would adhere to a set of narrow parameters that were preordained. So what were those parameters? Well, Defence Minister Richard Marles made those parameters clear, I think, in a couple of key addresses in November last year. The first was to the Submarine Institute, and the second was to the Sydney Institute. And Marles has since repeated these basic parameters, or these basic strategic assumptions that I think will underpin the Defence Strategic Review many times, elsewhere since then. And I think they've been echoed too in the remarks by both Brian and Alison. Essentially, according to Marles, the narrative is that because of deteriorating regional strategic circumstances, which basically means the rise of China, the security which our geographical isolation has afforded us up until now can no longer be assumed. For the first time since the Second World War, or at least in the 1970s when the so-called Defence of Australia doctrine emerged, we now face the prospect of a direct threat to Australia within a 10-year timeline, and which requires a significant military build-up to confront. Now, it's important to dwell on that point for a moment, because although I believe it's a misleading narrative and a misleading assessment, it actually reveals an important truth. The alliance has never fundamentally been about defending Australia against a high-level direct military attack, because we've never really faced one. In fact, there's a very good case to make that the threats that we have faced as a nuclear target during the Cold War, and at present, terrorism after 9/11, and today with the threat of war with China, only existed or were exacerbated at the very least because of our alliance with the United States.
At the end of the Cold War, all checks on that imperial interregnum, if you will, were released. There was no one in the world who could check the United States of America anymore, and therefore both political parties, with some differences which we can get into, I think that's significant today, especially for Australia, have been embarked on that imperial writ. Our security and foreign policy today is to secure the imperial writ. It's to make sure the United States has no challengers in the world. If you read the national security strategy we put out in George W. Bush's administration, you will see that we say no one will challenge us. And we're perfectly prepared to use military power to stop that challenge from coming. And many of the neoconservatives who crafted much of this strategy will tell you that if they see someone in the world who even vaguely looks like they might challenge U.S. power locally, regionally, or internationally, we're going to take them out. And usually we're going to use military power to do that. Now, that imperium is coming to some screeching halt in some ways right now because we can't feel the forces that we need to enforce it.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and thank you too for the acknowledgement. I too acknowledge this is Gadigal land and our collective obligation to walk together with First Nations peoples who have a lot to teach us about peace and non-violence, and work together with them for treaty and truth and true national justice. So this land always was and always will be First Nations land. We're gathered here 20 years on from a war that started from a series of lies. And we're gathered here, as we gather here, the most powerful forces in the media, the weapons industry and the political class are also gathering. But they're not gathering for peace. They're baying for war, and we must all be alarmed. Because 20 years ago, we went to war on a lie. And as Alison points out, we went to war without the Parliament ever having a say. No democratic oversight, no asking of the Australian people, no permission being sought from Parliament, and all based on a lie delivered to us by our US overlords. And that followed a concerted campaign from the very same groups who are baying for war right now. That campaign to send the US and its allies, including Australia, into what was a devastating and ultimately failed war with Iraq. the Middle East and much of the world has never recovered. And indeed, I'd say the United States has never recovered. And we're now at the 20th anniversary of that illegal invasion of Iraq, and we must learn from what happened. We owe that to the hundreds of thousands of Iraqis who've lost their lives as a direct result of the violence. The over 1 million Iraqis who are still displaced as refugees and who have a government that still can't provide their basic material needs or basic security. All from a war of aggression that our government, on our behalf, took part in, based on a lie, without ever asking us. So unless we learn from that history and demand accountability, then as the last week is so frighteningly proving, we are at serious risk of repeating it. Now, as a Greens MP and a Senator, I'll be frank, I didn't come into politics to agree with Bob Carr and Paul Keating. That wasn't my original plan. But hard politics makes unlikely allies. And the fact that we agree on calling out the recklessness of the AUKUS deal and the AUKUS submarines, the fact we agree proves just how broad the feeling in Australia is against this reckless deal. It proves it. We should be building a safe, peaceful future for Australia and our region. That should be our goal. And instead, the Albanese Labor government is seeking to permanently handcuff us to the United States military's aggressive warfighting plan. AUKUS is a handcuff for the Australian Treasury, for the Australian people, and for the Australian military. We're being taken to the next war, paid for by us, at the unquestioning direction of the United States. How can that be seen as anything other than a complete surrender of our sovereignty? And it is astounding that the Albanese government has officially adopted a hand-me-down coalition war plan. Like, they have become the coalition on this. And they have jettisoned decades of work from Labor grassroots members towards a more independent national stance. And they have jettisoned any pretence of a foreign policy based on peace and diplomacy. This is a national strategic surrender by federal Labor to the federal coalition, and it's to their eternal shame that they've done this. So, unless this deal is reversed, Prime Minister Albanese will go down in history as the Prime Minister who drove us towards a war we never chose and no Australian wanted. At least he'll go down in history, provided after that war, there's someone around to actually write the history. Because that's the scale of the decision-making we're facing here. That's what defence experts are telling us. That this war, not by our choosing, taken there by the United States, that this war may well escalate into a global catastrophe. You heard that from Colonel Lawrence earlier today, directly from the inside of the United States. So first, let's deal with the big lie behind this AUKUS deal. It is a lie to claim that these nuclear submarines are about defending Australia. They are all about projecting lethal force into the South China Sea. And that's worth repeating, and repeating often. These submarines are not designed to defend Australia. They are designed specifically to threaten China. And isn't any wonder China responds negatively to that? That's their purpose. And there is no question that will inflame regional tensions and further drive a regional arms race. And twice this week, I was asked by senior journalists, including on the ABC, that given the Greens don't support the $368 billion AUKUS submarine deal, what would the Greens do to prevent China invading Australia? I was asked that by people who pretend to be credible on this space. But there's not one credible defence analyst, not one, who says that that is the risk being faced by Australia. Yet it's been peddled in the media and peddled in this debate and driven by those forces who want us to sign this deal regardless. War is not inevitable. War is not inevitable, and the Greens join a growing chorus of former Prime Ministers, former Foreign Ministers, defence experts and millions of people from across the political spectrum who are pointing out the sheer recklessness of this deal. And the deal marks the official demotion of Australian diplomacy and the bypassing of Foreign Minister Penny Wong and Foreign Affairs for an international posture that's literally driven by the Australian Defence Forces and the global weapons manufacturers. And within our region, Indonesia, the Philippines and Malaysia have all expressed very real concerns. And we are getting with this deal at best, in 30 years, at best, 8 submarines. And we are fundamentally damaging our international reputation, our sovereignty, and our relations with almost every neighbour in the region who don't want us to do this. How does that make us any safer? It doesn't. It makes us isolated with just one friend in the region. And we shouldn't ignore the United Kingdom. They have no strategic presence in the region. We lose friends with every regional neighbour. We lose decades and decades of building connections to get 8 subs and a handcuff commitment to the United States military. That is almost the definition of making us unsafe and surrendering our sovereignty. So we need an independent defence force designed to protect Australia, not to threaten our neighbours, but to protect Australia. And that does not involve a $368+ billion spending splurge that literally is designed to enmesh us for decades to come in the United States military's war-making plans. Because it's a fact, we will not be able to crew, maintain, or deploy any of these nuclear submarines assets without the express prior permission of the United States.
We produced a document at UTS called Australia Talks China, replete with examples of stories loaded into our media with the help of security agencies to create the sense of a Chinese threat. And sometimes, of course, Chinese behaviour fed this. Mistreatment of Uyghurs, for example, in Western China. But everything was subject to almost elaborate exaggeration, beat-ups, hyperbole. One of our most experienced editors is someone called Max Such. He edited the Financial Review, he edited the old National Times. He investigated this China panic in the media. He said, there's an editor, he witnessed many campaigns in the Australian media over the years. He had never witnessed any as professional as the China panic campaign unleashed in our media from 2017. Malcolm Toohey, of course, introduced foreign influence legislation. It's on the books, it's been on the books for 5 years. It hasn't produced a single example of Chinese foreign influence. But I could instance the US Study Centre in Sydney, or ASPI, Australian Security Policy Institute, which receives funding from the State Department and American armaments countries, as pure examples of foreign influence seeking to shape Australian foreign policy that deserve the media registration. And that's before I indulge my pro-Palestinian prejudice and talk about another lobby, which is the best funded, most generously staffed foreign influence lobby you can imagine operating in Australia today, to see the Palestinian voice gets plotted out at every opportunity. So the deliberate China panic in the media, where was it coming from? Who was driving it? Why were some journalists being favoured with a special link, be at the home that you kept Muslim at 6 in the morning tomorrow? and you can have an exclusive about a raid on the home of a member of the New South Wales Upper House. That was 3 years ago. Shouqat Musulman's political career was destroyed. Not a finding has been made against him. Anyone would have assumed, as that story was packaged and massaged and presented exclusively to Nick McKenzie of the Sydney Morning Herald and 60 Minutes, that Shouqat Musulman had lent himself to become an agent of Chinese influence, as if a whip in the New South Wales Upper House was capable of knowing anything that would be of interest to Chinese agents taking an interest in Australia's geostrategic position. Absurd. I could go on. We brought these things when I was at UTS, we brought these things together in a publication. I think the clue to it lies in an article by someone who's now the director of the Office of National Intelligence, Andrew Shearer, who'd worked as foreign policy advisor to Tony Abbott and briefly for Toohey. He wrote in this giveaway article, there are some people here in Washington who's working for an American think tank at the time who think that Australia is still a very good ally, prepared to take the fight with America side by side in the Middle East. But Americans are beginning to doubt that Australia is such a strong ally in Asia. I think that was a seminally important article. And I believe that the biggest factor in this China panic, driving this consistent massaging of Australian media, were people in Australian security agencies who believed their counterparts in Washington were disappointed and fearful that we might not go all the way with the US against China, and wanted this corrected. I believe, without being remotely a conspiracy theorist, that this is a large part of the journey this country has been on. The professor of international relations at Chicago University, John Mearsheimer, an advocate of American national interest as a guide to foreign policy, said when he was in Australia a few years ago, I had the opportunity to meet him, I heard this from him directly, but he said the same thing publicly. He said, America will never allow its primacy to be challenged. We showed in World War I, defeating the Kaiser's Germany. We showed in World War II, defeating two rival empires. We've shown in defeating the Soviet Union that we will never allow our predominance to be challenged. The alternative view, friends, is that there is room for multiple sovereignties on this planet. And that if there could be a detente between Brezhnev's Soviet Union invading Afghanistan, supporting the North Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, presiding over an arms build-up, a detente between Brezhnev's Russia and America under Nixon, there can be detente between China under Xi and America under Biden or even Trump.
Now, 2, restate our commitment to international law and treaties that prohibit the threat or use of force against other countries. We need to advise our allies that Australia will not join a US coalition for war against China. And finally, we are standing here to remember opposition leader Simon Green's promise to the Parliament on the 20th of March, and the anniversary is tomorrow, on the 20th of March 2003, he promised that as Prime Minister, he would never allow Australian policy to be determined by another country, never commit to an unnecessary war when peace was possible, and never send Australians to war without telling them the truth. This is what we want our current government to remember on this day. Thank you.
In school, we are taught that the Prime Minister, the Governor-General, the Federal Executive Council make the decision to go to war. But the reality is that the major parties have abandoned this process now in favour of a system that allows the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister to wage war unilaterally without any checks or balances or direct safeguards. It's this process that has led Australia again and again into war after war without any clear goals. Millions have been killed in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria. Now, people in positions of power are able to do this because they make use of a vague amendment in the Defence Act which says that the Defence Minister has the ability to give orders on the general administration of the Defence Force. Now, it was an amendment that was clearly not intended to give the Defence Minister or the Prime Minister the unilateral power to wage catastrophic wars across the world. It is in fact a stunning example of the cowardice of the Labour members of this committee to have made an election promise to hold an inquiry into this process, an inquiry which found massive problems with the current system, and yet then to refuse to recommend any substantial changes to that broken system, regardless of the reality that a majority of submissions overwhelmingly called for significant reform. Now, the Greens have long held the position that the decision to send ADF personnel overseas must be made by the Parliament and, by extension, by the people of Australia. If a mother has to worry every night that her child is deployed in Iraq, even though that child wasn't even born in 2003, then the very least a local MP can do is take the responsibility of being there and explaining why they had to go.
Australians awoke this morning to a shift in the world order. The federal government moved to very publicly align its defence allegiance with the United States and the United Kingdom. The new defence and security partnership comes with an eye-watering price tag and a shift to nuclear power for the next fleet of submarines. The $90 billion deal with French company Naval Group and the French government has been torn up, and with it, some of the goodwill between the two nations. But the real target of this shift is China. Australia now publicly tying itself to the Biden and Johnson administrations in a move likely to inflame Beijing.
President Biden, joined by the Prime Ministers of the United Kingdom and Australia,
in sync across 3 continents. Leaders broadcasting a joint press conference over afternoon tea, dinner and breakfast.
Well, good morning from Australia.
With a global message.
Today we're taking another historic step to deepen and formalise cooperation among all 3 of our nations.
The first task of this partnership will be to help Australia acquire a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines. The future of the Indo-Pacific will impact all our futures.
Now trilaterally tightly bound.
Thank you, Boris. And I want to thank that fellow down under. Thank you very much, pal.
A new diplomatic club has been launched.
And so, friends, AUKUS is born.
AUKUS. It sounds strange and all these acronyms, but it's a good one.
Nuclear submarines were top of the agenda for Defence Minister Richard Marles during a series of high-level meetings in Washington. Mr Marles says he had constructive talks with the US National Security Advisor before meeting Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin in the Pentagon. There is growing concern over America's ability to help Australia acquire a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines as part of their AUKUS deal. That includes the UK.
Good evening. Australia is about to embark on a 3 decades long
mission to build a sovereign nuclear-powered submarine fleet, one of the most expensive programs in the nation's history. In a joint media appearance with Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, the US and UK leaders have delivered public backing to share their tightly controlled nuclear capability secrets in order to make it happen. The White House has condemned China's escalating military drills around Taiwan as provocative and irresponsible. The large-scale drills today entered a fourth day, with Taipei accusing Beijing of rehearsing for an all-out assault. And Australia's being drawn into the dispute too.
What we are calling for right now is a de-escalation of tension. That's what we need to see. It's obviously where Australia's national interest lies.
Taiwan is not a vital Australian interest, We have no alliance with Taipei. None.
I think the whole notion of AUKUS, which is basically 3 Anglo nations from thousands of kilometres away, gathering around China to encircle China. I mean, the notion of the people of the United Kingdom going to war against China, how on earth is it in their interests to go to war against this big power thousands of kilometres away? It's big power politics. It's not in the interests of the populations of those countries, but it's big power politics. It's about dominance, and frankly, it looks quite racist. 3 Anglo nations encircling China. It's hard to see it in terms that are in terms other than racism.
There's been no cutting back or slowing down of Australia's preparations for war.
Australia in recent years has moved away from the great tradition we had. Australia, especially in the UN, was very strong on disarmament and working for peace. We were a big player in getting the Arms Trade Treaty up and running. In more recent times, particularly since the arms industry itself in Australia has been more privatised, there's been the influence of these big corporations coming into our political and public space. And what we now see, unfortunately, are things like goals of being the 10th largest weapons exporter in the world. We are exporting weapons into the world's violent hotspots like the Middle East.
Anti-nuclear campaigner and former Labor Minister Peter Garrett has slammed Australia's AUKUS deal. He says the decision to acquire nuclear-powered submarines is a costly and risky action and should never have been allowed to stand. Garrett unloaded as it was revealed the US plans to sell Australia 220 Tomahawk-guided missiles. And Labor premiers are squabbling over where the nuclear waste from our new subs will be stored. Victoria and WA say South Australia is making the subs, so it should take the waste. South Australian Premier disagrees.
Where the nuclear waste is stored in Australia, should be where is the safest place to store it in the nation's interests.
There's a rumour doing the traps that AUKUS was a political ruse by ScoMo, a deal cooked up by Scott Morrison to wedge Anthony Albanese. Would Albo say no to ScoMo's surprise treaty with the Brits and the US and be derided as a chicken hawk, as weak on defence, a patsy for China? Or would he back it? Well, Albo had just 24 hours to decide, and he did. He backed it. 24 hours is hardly enough for a deal of this dimension, which will have historical consequences. Now, the wedge theory is just that, just speculation. But what we do know is that we are stuck with it. AUKUS has put us squarely in the mix for a US war with China over Taiwan. And that $370 billion spend on submarines is the biggest government spend in history. Now, our star columnist, the former submariner and Senator Rex Patrick, has done some outstanding work for us on AUKUS and the submarine debark in waiting. He's pointed out, and he should know he's a submariner, that like the footy team arriving after the grand final, the subs won't be here for years anyway, sometime in the 2030s. They are an enormous cost. It has not been thought through. There's no social licence for nuclear submarines. The debate has not been had. And defence, as Rex points out, has an appalling track record of wasting money on planes that don't fly and ships which need constant repair. As his latest piece points out, the first leg of the deal involves buying second-hand subs, old clunkers or rust buckets, as Rex unkindly calls them. To quote him on previous purchases of second-hand ships from the US Navy, Defence bought rust buckets and spent almost 10 times the purchase cost repairing them. Then he goes into the issues of maintenance and technical issues such as acoustic coating that deteriorates on Virginia-class nuclear submarines. These are the ones which we've agreed to buy. The guts of it is, though, that the boats which are due to arrive sometime in the 2030s, too late for a war, will not help much because we'll only be able to have 1 or 2 fully operational second-hand submarines at a time. Where will they be maintained? In the US or perhaps in Perth? How and at what cost? Where will they get the parts? Who knows? Where will they dock? Newcastle or Wollongong? Have we okayed this with the people of Newcastle or Wollongong? Will it make those cities a target? Who knows? But we do know that there has not been a lot of thought going into this. Despite the gargantuan spend, it has not been debated, let alone thought out. We should have invited the French into the alliance, then we could have called it AUKUS. But then we have already spent $4 billion with the French not buying a submarine.
I think we need to get away from the hypocrisy and not look at this as just those people, the enemy, doing this. I think we need to hold up a mirror and look at ourselves as well. You know, what role has the United States played in wars? Since the Second World War, the United States is virtually never at peace. So can the United States preach about the need for peace? And the answer to that would be no, probably they can't. Can Australia preach about the need for peace? Well, Australia has done some very good things, and yet when Australia goes to join every US war, practically without exception, without considering the merits of that war, without considering is this really going to help peace or is it not, then we've got a lot of thinking to do about our own role, and Australia could do a lot more to promoting a more peaceful world. The extent to which Australia acquiring nuclear-powered submarines, which we're told are going to be fuelled with highly enriched uranium, which is nuclear bomb fuel, what is that going to do to the non-proliferation regime? And the answer is it's going to be very, very bad.
Good evening. China has threatened to use all necessary measures to achieve the reunification of mainland China and Taiwan.
In the waters off Taiwan, China is carrying out its biggest live fire drills to date, starting in the wake of US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan and showing no signs of easing. All week, the Australian government had been careful not to comment on the Speaker's visit, but on Friday, Foreign Minister Penny Wong did comment on these drills, joining her US and Japanese counterparts in labelling them disproportionate and destabilising.
From the trajectory of the development of Chinese military technology and Chinese scientific technology, that by 2040, 2050, Australian submarines planning to sail through Indonesian waters up through the Philippines and the South China Sea to the East China Sea to sit outside Shanghai are going to be facing a very different underwater surveillance balance.
One of the problems with ASPI is that part of its charter is that it's independent of government and the defence organisation. It's supposed to be independent. So when we start having 1, 2 former defence ministers sitting on the governing council, you know, you're calling into question how independent the organisation really is, particularly when it's accepting large amounts of funding from the US government as well as the Australian government. They ought to be also independent of the influence of the arms industry, because the arms industry is so closely enmeshed in this secretive relationship with governments that they can't really be prized apart. So if an organisation such as ASPI wants to maintain the perception, which is what it says in its charter, the perception as well as the reality of its independence, it needs to take heed of that and consider that perhaps being sponsored by arms industry isn't a good idea.
Former Defence Minister Stephen Smith and former Defence Chief Sir Angus Houston provides a sense of urgency, finding the Defence Force is not ready to deal with the increased threat of conflict in the region as a result of China's massive military build-up.
In the circumstances that we now face, that defensive posture is no longer fit for purpose.
Focusing on 6 priority areas, including the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines and larger missile strike range.
We then have to think about the really serious question of how do we handle nuclear safety issues, not just at sea.
What's happening now is there's a noticeable increase in propaganda from all sides, and we're engaging in it along with America and Britain and so forth, and it's to the point you don't know what to believe. In the Ukraine, for example, I can't know whether what half is put out is true.
And the buck stops with me.
We hope Australia will view China and our relations rationally and positively.
Are you willing to get involved militarily to defend Taiwan if it comes to that?
Yes.
But our present security strategy keeps us chained to the past, chained to the extractive industrial economy with a security strategy designed to protect a system that is, in fact, the source of our future insecurity. So to use a metaphor, humanity's like a ship that's in a harbour, and we're anchored tightly with these big, heavy chains, and they're holding the ship very steady when it's calm. The chains have been there so long, holding us in place, that they've become rusted. So even if you want to bring up those chains and move on, you can't. The problem is that just outside this safe harbour where we're chained, something's happening out there. A big tsunami's on its way, and it will completely submerge the ship. So obviously the safest thing to do is drop the chains or cut the chains and get out of the harbour, get away from the coastline. But we don't. We stay stagnant, stuck. And we hear these whispers and little glimpses of warnings from outside this safe harbour.
No more gas, no more oil, keep the carbon in the soil. No more gas, no more oil, keep the carbon in the soil.
So just this week, Peter Carter, one of the senior scientists from the IPCC, his latest assessment was that by 2100 we're on track for 3.2 degrees, which he says is an uninhabitable planet. The only possible option is transformation in the decade between 2020 and 2030. But I'm sure that you can see that we can't do the massive transformation that we need to save ourselves and prepare for major warfare at the same time. They're incompatible.
Children realise that something's wrong there. Happy school strike, happy school strike. Any climate change is very unfair. Someone's profits are others' losses. Those who cause it are the least affected. Well connected, well protected. Those who suffer most have little choices. Unheard voices, unheard voices. For most people it's not funny and things are getting rough. The measures we are taking are really not enough. I find it hard to tell them that we are much too slow in cutting our emissions. It's a very, very mad world. Mad world. Mad world. Mad
world. My assessment is that something called the hyper threat, the hyper threat is global warming plus all forms of environmental degradation and destruction put together. In other words, the unravelling ecosystem and climate system together presents a new form of violence, and that over this century it will be the dominant form of killing, violence, destruction and harm. It's not a scientific or economic governance issue. It's the new way that violence is going to manifest. Going to war makes the hyper threat stronger.
What do we want? Army action! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Army action! When do we want it? Now!
Every time we put petroleum in our car, that is linked to the Iraq War, is linked to the death of 500,000 civilians, it's linked to PTSD and soldiers dying from Iraq. Operation Beauty, the aim of that, the mission of that operation, is to protect, restore and strengthen ecosystems. It's to rescue humanity's most important ally in the fight against the hyper threat, which is nature. Our number one ally, ally one, which is nature, is hanging by a thread at the moment. The more we rescue nature, our mate, the more it can help us. But at the moment it's struggling, it needs our help. Say no, you're not killing us. We are going to protect life. All of our life on this planet deserves to be alive. So get up and fight for it.
We honour the land that we're living on. We honour the land that we're living on. We honour the country and the old ones. We honour the country and the old ones. We sing up country and we sing it up strong. We sing up country and we sing it up strong. For we are all connected as one. For we are all connected as one. We are all connected as one. We are all connected as one. We honour the ones who have gone before. We honour the ones who have gone before. We honour the wisdom of the ancient law. We honour the wisdom of the ancient law. We sing up country and we sing it up strong. We sing up country and we sing it up strong. For we are all connected as one. For we are all connected as one. We are all connected as one. We are all connected as one. We honour the earth and the sea and sun. We honour the earth and the sea and sun. We honour the living and the life to come. We honour the living and the life to come. We sing very, very mad world. Mad world. Mad world. Mad world.
When our leaders talk about the possibility of war with China, do they really have any idea what they're talking about, what it would look like? And we don't just mean what would it look like from the war room, what would the strategies be? We mean what would it look like for the people who suffer the consequences? How many civilians would be involved? What sort of injuries would they have? How many refugees, how many people are likely to be displaced? Who's going to look after all of them? Where would they go? What are the possibilities of escalating to nuclear war, which is a whole different ball game in itself, and possibly terminal for much of the civilization that we know. So those who are blithely talking up the possibility of war with China, do they really have any concept of what they're actually talking about? And one suspects not.
is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned, or everywhere is war. Say war. Congo sees war. Children are dying. Oh. Until there are no longer first class, second class citizens of any nation. Until the color of man's skin is of no more significance than the color of his eyes, everywhere is war. War. Everywhere is war. Killing a brother. War. Destroying the country. War. For nothing. War. For nothing. They don't take care of an younger brother. We don't need no more war. Some winning, some losing, some dying, some crying, some sing. We don't need no more trouble. 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 What we need is love to guide and protect us on. If you hope good down from above, help the weak to get strong, yeah. Ooh, you got to stop the war. We don't need no more trouble. We don't need no more trouble.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us here in Australia for Peacewave. It's been a great deal of fun for us doing it, and I hope it reaches as many people as can take a lively interest in the subjects that we've been talking about today. They're important, they're critical, they're even existential, you might say. And the more of us take note of what our governments are doing and do our best to change things, the more chance we've all got, quite frankly, of surviving. It's been great to have you, and I'm delighted that you could join World Beyond War for this, and to listen to the views of people like Australians for War Past Reform. Thank you.